So I work for the American Friends Service Committee, and Friends are Quakers. Um, and Quakers are a pacifist organization, and historically they have served civilians on both sides of a conflict. So they take no sides. They're, as I say, pacifists. But through many, many wars, Quakers have gone and helped civilians. And what's different about my Vietnam story is that, one, I was a civilian and a female. I learned to speak Vietnamese. I was there for 3 years. I lived with and among the people. So I lived in a house with other team members. We didn't have gates or barbed wire or anything to protect us from the neighborhood. We lived just among regular Vietnamese people. The military, of course, lived on bases isolated from people and didn't usually speak Vietnamese. And even journalists would stay in hotels and might go out to the battlefield, and photographers too, but then come back. So that was one of the big differences. I lived in the most heavily fought over area in all of Vietnam, which is why the Quakers decided to start their project there, because there were so many injured civilians in that area. I was 3 miles from where My Lai occurred, and I was there 2 years after that happened. I worked with Vietnamese colleagues, and one of the philosophies of Quaker projects is that when they conceive of an idea and start a project, they feel that if within 5 years that project hasn't caught on, and if the local people haven't adopted the project, then they have the wrong idea and they change and leave. But they started this project, and I'll first describe my work before I go into the memoir of my friend, Mai. This is the cover of the book. So this is, the memoir is about my friend. We were almost the same age, and this was the two of us in 1972, which was a long time ago. This happens actually to be the only picture I have of us together. And I'll just, as I said, describe the project first, and then I'll go back and talk more about Mai, this woman that's here on the right. Let's see. I just put this slide in because to make the point that we were a pacifist organization. So if people came to the center to visit us, we asked that they leave guns at the door. Every day I would work at a rehab center, which was on the grounds of the local hospital. And the concept was that we were training Vietnamese in the art of making prostheses. Obviously, we made a lot of prostheses. These are limbs stacked up on a bench at the end of a day. Then patients were fitted for their limbs. You can see women on the left who are getting, one has an artificial limb here that she's putting her leg into, and then do gait training back and forth until they could walk well on their legs. Among the children were the greatest victims of landmines, but particularly boys, because the little boys would go out in the morning and take the water buffalo out, and many times the mines hadn't been deactivated, so the boys would lose their limbs. This is a girl practicing, and then this boy on the right happened to be one of my favorites. I called him the Elastic King because it's not a particularly good photograph, but maybe you can see that he has woven elastics around his neck. The kids would play a game with elastics, shooting them at little, actually spitballs they put on the ground. And he, even though he lost one eye, two legs, and one arm, was a mastermind at hitting the goal. And he sometimes cheated, but he was very feisty. And once he got his limbs, he turned out to just be quite a charming boy. When he was at this stage and was cheating, he could sometimes be quite naughty and get in trouble. Well, once he had his limbs, he was happy to be on his way. We started to train women as prosthetist. The Quakers brought in British prosthetists to train the Vietnamese, and I don't think the British had, at least at that time, 50 years ago, any female prosthetists. But Mai said to me once, well, there's so many women that have lost limbs, why don't you train them? So here you see, these are actually both of them have lost limbs. The woman on the left is being trained as a prosthetist. I sort of chuckled when I saw this picture of a former patient who is a prosthetist, but he's taken off his limb, I guess, to climb onto the bench to get a better angle to work on the artificial, he's got a piece of wood in there, he's shaping the top of the limb. We made bicycle parts. We made wheelchairs out of bicycle parts because Americans in Western style wheelchairs just, don't have enough balance to them. They would tip over, especially in rural areas. So I'm going to go back here. So people would ask me, how did I feel working with like 100 people who'd lost limbs every day? Some were paralyzed, some were burned badly. And if you read my book on page 195, I write, no matter one's political sympathy, the Vietnamese patients, felt past part of a whole. The whole country was suffering, and they were grateful to walk again and help their families and villages in some capacity. After the war, Vietnam looked forward, which is not true for America and our feelings about the war. Millions of us were touched by the war and are still seeking answers and reconciliation. But it was different for the American soldiers. They went to war as individuals, and they came back to the U.S. mostly alone, to separate locations and families and friends, and to a society that didn't always understand their suffering and experience. Being part of a whole, rather than being an individual, was a fundamental difference between my friend Mai's Vietnam's culture and that of the U.S. It was pretty hairy at times being there. We were in an area that was pretty much surrounded by the Viet Cong almost the entire time I was there. We would take patients out into communist-held territories, but because we were known to be pacifists, we went without any problems. But at one time, the city was completely surrounded, and the American military came and said, we have to evacuate now. We want you out in the morning. And we, as it turned out, just really couldn't come to a decision. Our medical people didn't want to leave the people that were trained, they didn't want to leave their patients. Other of us felt torn. I was really scared. I would have been happy to leave, but we ended up staying. Several times this happened. And things worked out to be okay. But my friend Mai said to me, I think it might be a good idea for you to I will help you make contact with, quote unquote, the other side. In other words, with the Viet Cong. She said, the Quakers are well known around the city because the patients go home to various villages and hamlets. But when the North Vietnamese come closer to the city or the Viet Cong, they don't necessarily know who you are. So this was my big moment of espionage, because what she had me do was to write on a tiny piece of paper, the Quakers are pacifists, we're trying to help patients, we'll stay no matter what government is in power, we're here to be helpful to the people who've been injured. And then I roll it up and wrap it in plastic and seal the ends. And she had it taken to the marketplace. It was put inside a fish. The fish was put into a basket for somebody who bought it, and it was transferred from one person to another till it got to the jungle and the mountains. And a couple of months later, I got an answer from a man named Brother Five. And we began a correspondence. And it turned out that when the North Vietnamese took over the city in 1975, no one at the hospital or at the Quaker house was injured. So I hope that awareness of who we were helped a bit. Now, the second part of the work I did, and this is quite unusual because I was able maybe to be the only person during the war who had direct contact with prisoners, political prisoners. These are South Vietnamese who were being held by their own government. And they were held right on Main Street in these kind of warehouse buildings surrounded by barbed wire, and you can see towers to watch them. And it was basically a concentration camp that held 1,000 political prisoners. It was hard to know who the enemy was, so the government would round up people and let some people go, and then others were, in fact, tortured in the middle of this center. The Quakers were given access to the prison where we gave medical aid, but we weren't given access to this facility. However, at one point, they decided, whoever the powers to be decided that they would, if people were, they would bring people to the hospital and put them in a prison ward. Better that they die at the hospital than in an interrogation center, because then it would be evidence that they might have been tortured at that location. So I took pictures I was able to get access to the prison ward at the hospital, and I took pictures of various prisoners. This is a woman who was paralyzed from the torturing, and both her legs were broken. A 14-year-old boy who his father was actually a nurse at the hospital, but he was carrying medicine near an area where the Viet Cong were in control, and they picked him up. On the right are two men that had been held in tiger cages. I don't know if any of you read about this during the war. This was an island off of the south of part of Vietnam, and these were cells under the ground, and there were bars on the top. The guards could walk on the top, but the people in the cells weren't allowed out. They weren't allowed to exercise. So when they were released, their muscles had atrophied, and they were paralyzed. And this was one of those moments of realizing your they call it survivor's guilt, because both these men were my age, but they've been in prison for like one 8 years and one 14 years. And I thought about, all I'd done, all I'd been privileged to do with my family and, hiking and skiing or whatever. And they were in prison. This was the ward at the hospital. It was amazing that I had access. I had a bag of medicine. I went in as the interpreter for our doctor. This is the women's side of the room. Because many of the women have been tortured with electricity, afterwards they convulsed. It was as if they had epileptic seizures. And this was probably one of the most horrifying things that I witnessed when I was there. So I was there 3 years and obviously had a very intense experience. But I left in 1973. I came back and I worked for Amnesty International. I spoke about political prisoners around the U.S. and in Europe. And during the years after 73, I wrote to Mai, and she wrote back to me. We were writing in Vietnamese. She didn't speak any English. She was very understanding with my Vietnamese. I speak as if I have salt water in my mouth because the area where I lived had a real drawl. So you can imagine, here's this Caucasian woman who's speaking with like a real Southern accent. So Vietnamese just crack up when they hear me. She spoke with the same accent, and once when we were in a taxi together in Hanoi, the taxi driver said, "Would you please speak Vietnamese?" And she said, "I'll have you know, sir, I was born and bred in Vietnam. I'm just from this region with a heavy accent." But we began to lose touch after the war ended. I was working in Europe, and she moved. But I love this letter because she puts, just in case the postman or woman wants to know who I am, she puts my Vietnamese name in parentheses. But she made a mistake because she wrote 7 Plant Street, and I lived at 7 Plant Court in Groton, Connecticut. So the letter got sent back to her, and we lost touch. I did pretty well in reading her letters, but sometimes I would go to the nail salons because, of course, a lot of Vietnamese women are working in the nail salons. And I'd say, I don't understand this word, or I need to write this word, and then they'd help me. But sometimes I'd also eavesdrop because were never suspecting that I could speak Vietnamese. So 35 years went by. That's a long time. And the war, after the war ended, relationships weren't so good between Vietnam and the U.S., so it took years before people began to go back and forth. But anybody I knew that was going to Vietnam, I'd ask, can you get in touch with her? And I just couldn't find her. But in 2001, I decided my 2 children were grown, and I thought it might be time for them to go back to Vietnam with me, because I also went with someone else who worked with the program, and they had 2 children that were my children's age, so that made it sort of nice for all of us. And when I was going, I contacted somebody to buy some train tickets, and she said, "Well, I'm sorry you can't find your friend. Why don't you advertise on TV? That's what people do, because after the war, so many people, were lost." I said, "But the problem is I didn't even know her real name, and I don't know where she moved to." Well, this young woman, my daughter's age, just picked up the phone, called the rehab center where we all used to work, happened to talk to an employee who'd been there when I was there and when Mai was there, and said, "Oh, yeah, she lives in such and such a town." So then there was this three-way communication between Vietnam. This woman would email me, and then I would email her back, and then she'd call Mai, and we arranged to have a rendezvous when I got to the area near where she lived. So Mai writes to me and says, "I got your letter, full of excitement and expectation and nostalgia. Our boundaries of hatred to arrive together as true friends in the spirit of those who love each other. This human love doesn't know distinctions of skin, color, or political line. When I met you, I was like a fish in a basket, a severely wounded girl, an enemy of your country, and my life was in their power. But in my heart, I always trusted you as a friend. While our people purposely clashed with each other and tried to kill each other. But now, to meet you again after 30 years, my fondest wish has been granted." So I arrive in Vietnam, and I write, "I recognized the distinctive scent of Vietnam the minute I landed. The ubiquitous fermented fish sauce smell used in cooking, blended with diesel fumes and the sweet smell of familiar flowers. The sights and sounds spoke of peace. Does peace have a sound? Yes, it is the absence of the sound of war. I took deep breaths and slid into my return to Vietnam with hope and excitement." So then we travel and we get near Tam Kỳ, which is where I was going to meet Mai. The road was full of potholes. My calculations of time were off. In those pre-cell phone days, I had no way of reaching Mai, as 1 hour turned into 3 as my being late. When we arrived, I rushed up to the stairs of our meeting location. A staff person answered my question. "Yes, there was an old woman waiting for you with another woman, but they left." I was frantic. I had come halfway around the world after 35 years, and I suspected I had missed the chance to meet Mai. Then I saw her, and I recognized her immediately. Her hair was cut short, and mine wasn't shoulder length anymore either. We embraced. We hugged and hugged. A double amputee needs a crutch for balance, but mine didn't have hers. I was holding so tight we were like one tree that couldn't fall over. Our daughters stood watching. We finally let go, our faces wet with tears. "Mai," I said, "this is my daughter, Mariah Mai. And this must be your daughter." The two young women, the same age, shyly hugged. Mai grabbed my arm and shook it. "What? Her name is really Mai?" "Yes," I replied. "I named her in honor of you, and this is the happiest moment for me, that Mai and Mai met." That tickled Mai. There were more tears and laughter. I went back to Vietnam several times after I had this amazing reunion with Mai. First, I was researching for a book that was published in Vietnam. Later, I went back and I was giving loans to Vietnamese who suffered from the effects of Agent Orange. The third time I went back, I actually had more time. I wasn't working on a project. And I went to her very humble house and just had 2 weeks where I was able to just visit with her and spend time. So I get to her house, and at night she says, "Okay, I want you to take my my little room and sleep on my bed. And Vietnamese sleep on very hard wooden beds, platforms, and sometimes with a little bamboo mat on top. And I said, but where are you going to sleep? And she said, well, you know, Jane, when I take off my legs, I'm the size of my kitchen table. I'm just going to sleep on the kitchen table. So that's how we made out. And as I interviewed her, I learned more about why she'd lost her legs. This is her identity card. It's a false identity card. It's the name I knew her by, Mai, but that was not her real name. She was an alias. Mai was an alias, or nom de guerre, as they say, because she was really working for the liberation forces, the Viet Cong. Her father had fought against the French, and when the Americans came, she didn't want foreigners controlling her country, and so she joined the Viet Cong and been part of the liberation movement. First she was a teacher, and then she became an expert in propaganda. She was a Communist Party member after she was wounded. She was given that honor. But she was on a mission on International Women's Day, which is March 8th. She was in a village, and there was a big gathering of women. She was doing sort of a consciousness-raising sessions with them and talking to them about why they should be for the freedom of their country. And she said, afterwards, I was walking away and to go to another location. And usually if the American troops are around, we can tell because they have helicopters, they've got noise. When they march, they're so loud, they're like the elephants in the jungle. So, but I wasn't aware that there were any Americans in the area. But suddenly, a claymore mine, which is a semicircular mine on prongs, was set up as 330 metal pellets inside. And a U.S. soldier, activated the mine, and the pellets flew out and blew off both her legs and ripped her stomach open. Then the same soldiers that injured her saved her life. They put her in a helicopter and took her to the Chu Lai Marine Military Base. The doctors operated on her. She never knew what happened internally to her. She knew she lost her legs, but no one explained in Vietnamese what had happened internally. But she had a lot of stitches across her stomach. She was held as a prisoner of war because they suspected she'd been with the Viet Cong. But after a while, she said, I think they began to figure out there wasn't much I could do to help the enemy. I mean, I have no legs. Who am I? What use am I going to be? So they flew her in a helicopter to the local hospital where I was working. And when she heard that she could get legs, we were the only civilian facility in all of Vietnam because the military took care of their own. So when she found out she could get legs, she was so excited. And as she came to the center every day and practiced and worked, the staff got to appreciate her drive, her enthusiasm. She had a fantastic sense of humor. She was kind. So she was hired to be staff. And that's how I got to know her during those 3 years that we worked together. I think you could see her sense of humor where she put petals from a flower and stuck them on her face. So because I knew so little about her past, I during these interviews while we were together those 2 weeks, and obviously I knew she had a child. So I said, what happened? Were you married? Did you have a husband? And so this is quoting from the book. I still hadn't heard from my husband after the war ended, and it had been nearly 10 years. Yet I still held out hope that he would make his way home. But maybe he'd been killed or was recuperating in a hospital in the north. Then one day I was reading in the newspaper when I noticed something unusual. I mean, this has been 10 years after the war ended, and it's been about almost 15 or more years that she'd heard from him. So I see something unusual in the newspaper. A person with the same name and engineering profession as my husband, Lee, was running for office in the National Assembly. My head swirled, and I almost lost my breath with the joy of knowing he might be alive. But then I said to myself, how could this be? Could my husband have returned from the north and not contacted me? And how could he be so well established in the South that he can run for national office? Okay, I'm going to skip over a whole bunch of, a whole section. But Mai finally is able to meet with her husband. And he comes to her house. And she writes, once we were in the house, he didn't even wait until I served the traditional tea before presenting me with a divorce agreement. Yeah, Lee said, I want you to sign this because you can't have any children. Maybe he said more words than that, but those were the only words that I remembered. I was outraged. How do you mean I can't have any children? What proof do you have? When I worked at the Quaker Center, lots of amputees, even a paralyzed woman had a child. You are rejecting me because I've lost my legs, not because I can't have children. This is not the revolutionaries' philosophy. We all sacrifice together. And this is my favorite line. I might not be physically stronger than before my accident, but I am mentally more able than before. There is joy in regaining one's life with artificial limbs. I am not handicapped, and I can have a child. I am totally convinced. I used all the motivational techniques I had learned as a provincial propaganda officer. A torrent of words flowed out. I pleaded, give me a few months. I can prove that I can have children like any other women. I am your wife. Now, to find out why Mai did end up having a child, you're going to have to read the book, because that's a whole long episode. But she does have a child, and because you saw that picture of my daughter and her daughter together, so that was very, very special. So I went back on a couple other trips, and at one trip at the airport, we were sitting together, and I said, Mai, would you ever consider coming to the U.S.? And she said, well, your country held me as a prisoner of war. Do you think they'd arrest me if I came? I mean, I'm a Communist Party member. Your country doesn't like communists. And I said, no, he wouldn't be arrested. But I also just couldn't imagine this woman who'd never been on a plane. She'd never been outside of the province. She was worldly wise, but not in the sense of knowing a lot about international travel. I didn't know what her reaction to the U.S. would be. And in fact, I mean, the New Jersey Turnpike was just amazing to her. It's like, whoa, 6 lanes. But she decided to come. And those of us that knew her wanted to pay for a plane ticket for her and for her daughter. And she said, there's an economic difference between us, and if I accept your money, it will change our relationship. I've never asked you for money, and I'm not going to now. But she did allow us to pay for her ticket, but she and her family paid for her daughter to accompany her. And we had a pretty amazing time. This is the picture on the left. She's in Vermont, and someone on the program, a nurse on our program, had knit that shawl for her. And this is a picture on the right the last time that I went back. And her son-in-law had done pretty well, and he was able to build a little family compound because his father had had a stroke. So his father and mother were in a big house with him and his wife and my grandchildren. And then Mai had a little house next door, just a tiny little house. But it was so lovely to see all of them in a compound. She wasn't sleeping on the kitchen table anymore. And the grandkids could run back and forth. And this is an American-made umbrella, because American umbrellas, you can find them at TJ Maxx, and they're really strong. And she loved that umbrella. So she writes to me and says, even though you and I are two different people with different languages, different customs, and different styles of life and activity, I consider you a very close friend, a heart-related sister. What are you doing today, Jane? Are you tired from work? Let me share your tiredness, okay? Let me share your loneliness, your sadness, if you have any. I frequently get the feeling that you are nearby. Your image stays with me as if you've been here yesterday. Life has gotten better here. I am sitting in my own homeland. This place is no longer at war. It is quiet and peaceful. My life has sprouted its green leaves anew. She has an 8th grade education. Life is very free and happy. I remember your face even though separated from me by half the circumference of the globe. I want our children to be friends with each other the way we were friends. Although social class differences keep people from truly understanding each other and respecting each other, it is my hope that people everywhere can be equal and move to a world of peace with no stronger versus weaker people. I hope that will happen in our world. It's not a very good time to believe that will happen, but it just was an interesting and revealing experience for me to meet a woman who was my enemy and who had such faith in peace and reconciliation.